After a week full of political news featuring complex stories like the vetting of Mandelson, an apparent threat to the Falklands Island, and inflation rising, there's been a lot to follow. And if you've had a busy week or just don't follow the news, you've probably missed most of it. If that's you, or maybe you just want to know more about all of this from a guy who has spent a little too much time reading the news this week, then you are in the right place. This episode of the Roundup by News of the Week will explain all the news as clearly and accessibly as possible. It will analyse all the biggest stories fairly and will answer all the biggest questions on British politics this week. As always, you can check all my sources and read this episode of the Roundup on newsoftheweek.net, so go check that out once you're done here. First up, though, on policy change, one thing reported this week was the death of the assisted dying bill, and Sky News showed how it could become law. We've covered the situation with the assisted dying bill on the roundup before, but for those that are new, especially, essentially it progressed through the Commons as a private member's bill, so it was not sponsored by the government or any party. It was led by MPs. In the Lords, after it passed through the Commons, where there's more scrutiny on legislation anyway, amendments were stacked on it, with many fearing there was not enough safeguards behind it. There were so many of these amendments that they could not all be debated within the parliamentary session, which the bill had to be for it to be passed. So it's died. Letters have been sent to MPs and the governments advocating for certain things to be done to either override the Lords and push the bill through, or to leave it where it is. And there are still ways for it to be introduced, but most of these ways require the government to act, which it has declined to do so far, because for so long now in politics, the issue has been one of principle for individual MPs. Now, Sky's assessment noted that while the bill is currently over as it is, it's still possible for it to come back because the issue is not settled amongst politicians or the public, and that's fair analysis, but it isn't obvious that any further route to future legislation will have a different fate to what's currently happened, because the government at the moment, like I said, are currently the government at the moment don't seem moved to aid the bill, and there's no reason that a second bill wouldn't be treated the same way. But there was also some talk of new legislation this week, with the BBC reporting that Starmer is planning new powers to tackle state-backed terror groups. The big questions about this, though, are will it come through and when? The BBC's article talks about creating new powers which would allow the government to ban state-sponsored terror groups by making it an offence to support or promote the groups listed as threat by the government. This has been an issue for many MPs, many activist groups, and within the country, and it's already been banned in other European countries, according to the BBC. And now, this follows a independent review by the government last year, which concluded that they would need to introduce more powers in order to tackle these state-backed groups. However, this was also something the government promised to do during a general election in 2024, when the BBC noted they stepped back from doing so once they got into power, or that they have done so far. So in terms of whether it will go through and whether we'll actually see it, the legislation is being planned, and it does seem to deal with MPs' concerns, the activists' concerns, the public concerns, and it would satisfy their election promises, all while following the recommendations of an independent review. So while it has been abandoned and the form of the government on this issue has been a little bit rocky, this seems more like a natural progression rather than like a spur of the moment decision. That means we're more likely to see it than we were when it was just an election claim, and that makes it a whole lot more likely to pass. Moving on, though, to foreign policy, there's been some Trump-based comments on the UK this week, which we have to talk about. Firstly, the Independent reported over Trump threatening tariffs, but are we sure that we'll actually see them? This story was over the digital services taxes, which are a 2% tax introduced on revenues of some major companies, most of which come from the USA. Trump lit this 6-year-old tax back up into the news, saying the UK could, saying that the US could retaliate on the UK very easily, so that the UK better be careful. Obviously, the US president's foreign policy has defied expectations time and time again in his second term. So while it previously might have been out of the question for the US to impose tariffs out of nowhere, there isn't as straightforward to say that at the moment. Also, relations between the leaders are quite frosty. The Independent also covered the USA's Falklands threat, which was the other element of UK-based news that come out of the US this week. And we're going to look at what the threat really means. Will we actually see an issue over the Falklands in the 21st century? So an internal Pentagon email was leaked this week, which outlined options for reactions to NATO members not joining the USA in their war in Iran. The specific issue for the Pentagon or those who wrote the leaked memo was that countries did not grant the USA access to basing and overflight, called ABO. ABO, according to the Pentagon, is the baseline terms of NATO in terms of the USA's expectations for member countries. So the email outlined options for reactions from the USA. Reuters, who broke the story, did not share the memo, but these options were but the options range from provisions suspending difficult countries from their roles or positions on NATO, and suspending Spain has been widely talked about as well. The Independent picked up the Falklands element as part of the memo, reportedly suggesting that the US could reassess its diplomatic support for long-standing European imperial possessions, like the Falklands. Well, both outlets noted that none of the options included the USA leaving the alliance or even closing their bases in Europe, so there are limits on this memo. The reaction in Britain was staunch. The PM spokesperson said the UK's position on the Falklands was clear and unchanged, and that sovereignty rests with the UK and the island's right to self-determination. Other parties in the UK called the Falkland Islands a British territory. The Argentine foreign minister said his country was ready to resume bilateral negotiations and characterised the Falklands as being in a colonial situation. Now, in terms of whether they are actually under threat, there is consensus in the UK that they are British, and the Falklands government itself expects the British government to uphold its commitment to self-determination, which was shown in 2013 when 99.8% of voters voted to stay a part of the United Kingdom. Now, also, the concern here comes from a leaked memo, not an announced policy, which means it carries a little bit less weight, particularly when the USA has always been neutral on the Falklands and their direct support was not as intense as it might have been back in the 80s. Not only that, but there have been other provisions in the memo which aren't necessarily possible, with a NATO official saying there isn't a mechanism to suspend states within the organisation. So while the situation is the same as the story we just covered, with the USA being more unpredictable and um, on worse terms with ally countries like Britain, it's still not clear that this will go ahead because it is only a memo, and these are quite extreme steps to take, which haven't really been taken before, which some of them don't have precedent to take. Apart from that, though, we've got to keep up with the situation in Iran, and a lot has happened this week. But the question is has anything actually changed? Well, last week talks almost collapsed, despite a deal being reportedly close on Friday. Now, US military action was also raring to go and was waiting, likely as a backup to the negotiations. However, Pakistan requested the USA would withhold its strikes so Iran could submit a proposal within its talks. Now, Iran then pulled out the peace talks, saying that there was no prospect of them participating in them in the first place. And just this weekend, Trump was prompted to say that the US would not send representatives to Iran to talks in Pakistan, and that Iran could just call if they wanted to talk. This is after Iranian representatives made it clear they would not participate in talks and any dialogue would be indirect. AP News reported on comments from anonymous Pakistani officials who said there were doubts that the USA was serious about diplomacy. So that means the situation hasn't changed. The ceasefire is still unstable, the blockades still exist, and the threat of military action still looms. Also, communication seems to be less secure than it was last week, and obviously there is still some sort of gap between the two sides, so it seems no closer, and it seems no closer to being bridged. On the other elements of this conflict, though, with the situation between Lebanon and Israel, there seems to be it seems to be going in the opposite direction. That is because the ceasefire between the two countries has been extended by 3 weeks, with Trump posting that he and members of his government met with their Lebanese counterparts, saying that there would be further meetings and that the two countries would work together to help Lebanon protect itself from Hezbollah. The prospect of peace in Lebanon is far easier in other areas of the world, according to Donald Trump, and it seems that This comes from there being unity in the situation over there and an agreement between the two countries' officials. So overall, there's been some change, particularly in Lebanon with Israel, while the situation in Iran with the USA is less secure and still uncertain. Moving on to general politics, the situation between the government and vetting Mandelson has been in the news again. There have been new developments. The question is, will Starmer go now? Well, last week it came out that Mandelson was not vetted correctly, but number 10 made it clear Starmer did not know about those failures. However, there were questions over the pressure of continuing scrutiny and what that was doing for Starmer and whether he misled Parliament. As well as that, Sir Ollie Robbins was sacked. He was the man responsible for that Mandelson's vetting in the first place. Since then, Robbins appeared in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Robbins said he did not tell anyone in Number 10 about vetting concerns, but insisted that Downing Street was relentless in pushing for Mandelson to be installed as foreign ambassador. He also noted he made an entirely different suggestion for the position, but that the Foreign Office was under pressure to end the vetting process. He did say it was not exerted by political figures, but by Number 10 officials. On Mandelson's case specifically, the concerns which were raised did not necessarily relate to Epstein, and his case was considered borderline. Regardless of that, security officials were apparently minded to go against clearing him, and despite this, and for reasons that aren't yet clear, Robbins explored mitigations for the concerns for Mandelson and then decided to give him clearance anyway. The difference between Robbins and the security services has so far been attributed to Robbins mischaracterizing their positions, but other evidence from the Select Committee suggested that some within the Foreign Office told Robbins that Mandelson didn't even need to be vetted in the first place due to his position within British politics being on things like the Privy Council. The Eye noted this was also considered naive and mind-bogglingly stupid by security officials. Now, also, Robbins confirmed that Mandelson had access to top-secret information before his vetting officially took place, which calls Starmer's claims that due process was followed into further question. Now, will Starmer go in light of this new information? Well, as with last week, it isn't clear whether Starmer himself has actually broken the rules and whether he has actually violated standards. Although there now seems to be more reasons to doubt his account, the process would still take time, in the range of months to around a year. Now, it's been reported that members of the cabinet are distancing themselves from the Prime Minister, with Angela Rayner telling Starmer not to appoint Mandelson, Miliband saying he feared the appointment would blow up or go wrong, and others saying they had private concerns but that they didn't share them with Keir Starmer. Not just within the cabinet too, we've known for weeks that some in Labour have outwardly said the PM should resign and that there is discontent within the party. In the last few days, the Eye noted that the mood in the party was angry, according to a senior MP. However, they also reported a challenge is unlikely before the local elections due to the party's expected poor performance and due to a mix of other things like resistance to changing PMs during a war, opportunities not being taken before, and there's currently still no viable alternative. Overall, it seems like the PM is still clinging on, despite his situation coming under increased pressure and scrutiny. However, within Parliament, the reports seem to be that Starmer will go, just that won't happen yet. Moving on from Mandelson, The Guardian reported that victims of sexual violence have been distressed by MPs' questions. But the real question here is, will there be any fallout from it? And after survivors of sexual violence gave their evidence to a public bill committee over changes to jury trials, they were reportedly met with questions that were pugnacious and disrespectful. Survivors told The Guardian that the questions played a large part in their emotional breakdowns that occurred after they gave evidence. The specific part where the questions descended into reported disrespect was over the impact of limiting jury trials, and following the testimony from victims over the questions, the Victims Commissioner made a formal complaint to the Parliamentary Liaison Committee, which deals with complaints from committees within Parliament. This was then escalated to the Deputy Speaker, which is apparently an unusual step to take, and then they said that members should adopt an appropriate tone for questioning which recognised survivors' courage. I am pretty confident there will be no further action taken, though, as the response from the liaison committee was advisory and as that is their role. So no, it's unlikely there will be any more action following the complaints, at least at the moment. Moving on to news on stats and trends, though, BBC News picked up a story on the unemployment rate falling unexpectedly. They said that fewer students were looking for work, but the question is that really a win for the economy? They're talking about ONS statistics, which showed unemployment fell to 4.9% in the first few months of the year, despite predictions saying it would rise or stay at 5.2%. As job vacancies fell to their lowest level in 5 years at 711,000, and the inactivity rate rose by 0.3%, the ONS chief noted the unemployment rate was solely down to a rise in economic inactivity. Essentially, these things mean more people are not looking for work and that less jobs are being advertised. When people are not looking for work and they're not being considered or unemployed, that would explain the decrease. Basically, that means the decrease is pretty much a technicality, and that the economy is still expected to fare badly in the coming months, as we covered last week. This isn't really a meaningful improvement in the economy at all. Now we know that's not a win, with unemployment falling, but another story from the Times this week noted the UK inflation has jumped to 3.3%. The outstanding question over this is how bad is it that there has been a rise, and how bad will it actually get? Well, again, we're talking about ONS data, which showed inflation rose by 0.3% between February and March. This was the first estimate that took rising oil prices into account. Now, the chief economist at the ONS, Grant Fitzner, said this was mainly due to increased fuel prices, followed by airfares and food prices as well, which also increased. Now, various inflation rates, which take different things into account, also rose in some way, shape, or form, showing that this is in a small way already leading to price rises across the board. In theory, this could have implications for interest rates. Essentially, that's the price of government borrowing, but this is actually expected to be held at 3.75% when the Bank of England next assesses them. So yes, an increase in inflation when it's already above the 2% target is not good, but a lot of the worst impact over things like inflation rates and essential goods like food, is at the moment limited. Also, we've seen higher inflation than this in recent years following COVID and the war in Ukraine. So in context, this increase is still fairly small. It's still quite manageable. So let's zoom out. The assisted dying bill has officially failed but could come back in the future. The government are planning new powers to ban state-backed terror groups, and that's all while the USA has threatened tech tariffs and could be plotting over the Falkland Islands. Uncertainty is still the major story with the conflict in Iran, while we could be seeing more stability in Lebanon. Starmer's sticky situation over Manson's vetting seems to have gotten stickier again, and victims issued complaints in the comments. Finally, the latest stats and trends show the economic situation has got worse despite falling unemployment, with inflation starting to climb. That's the news this week from News of the Week. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Roundup, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing, uh, or better yet, share this video with a friend because that helps even more. I'll be back next week so you can get your news again. I'll see you later. Bye.